Good afternoon. Today I wanted to concentrate on the year 1942 as a pivotal year in the Holocaust. But before turning to that, to kind of set the stage and how my discussion of 1942 will be very different than how I approached the previous year in Holocaust history, that is of 1941. 1941 was a year of decisions. This is when I argue that the Third Reich, the Nazi regime, undertook two incremental decision-making processes, one starting in the spring in preparation for the invasion of the Soviet Union and coming to closure in late July of 1941, that sealed the fate of Soviet Jewry, that all Soviet Jews were then to be killed as quickly and systematically as possible. And key in bringing that to closure were Himmler's decision to supplement the 3,000 men of the Einsatzgruppen with some 20,000 men from various SS and police units, and to basically give them retargeting instructions. Up until late July, they had been mainly targeting adult male Jews of military age, and thereafter, increasingly, they were targeting women, children, and the elderly, and clearly they were now going after the entire Jewish population. Once one is killing the women and children, clearly the goal is genocidal to ensure that there is not another generation. The second decision-making process really began in the summer when the question is raised then, what about the fate of the rest of the Jews of Europe, those to the west of the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop line, the demarcation line between Stalin's Russia, Soviet Union, and Hitler's Germany in 1939, that Hitler, of course, crossed in 1941. And here I argue that by late October, the Germans had reached a solution to that as well. That three things came together: a deportation program to send the Jews of Central and Western and Southern Europe to camps in Poland. These camps in Poland were going to be new in one way. They were not just concentration camps, but they were equipped with gas chambers. They were to be what we now call death camps rather than just concentration camps. And simultaneously, the Third Reich now forbid any emigration from Europe. Up until this point, the goal of the Nazis had been what I call expulsion and decimation, to chase out as much of the Jewish population from Europe as possible, under conditions that ensured many of the victims would perish. But it was a goal then, a simultaneous goal of decimation and expulsion. Now that is reversed. Instead of trying to get Jews out of Europe, they are forbidden to leave. The emigration gates are closed. All Jews in the German grasp are to be kept within the German grasp in order to be sent to the death camps for immediate and systematic extermination. So it is those two decisions that basically seal the fate of the Jews of the former Soviet Union and then the Jews of occupied Europe. Now, some historians have talked about a kind of sequence. At first, the Germans shot Jews, then they gassed them. In fact, the division is not time-wise, one first and the other second. It is geographical. Jews to the east of the demarcation line, 1939 demarcation line between Soviet and German spheres of influence, continued mostly to be killed by firing squads, by shooting, the so-called Holocaust by bullets. Jews to the west of that line, for the most part, now would be killed in gas chambers with poison gas. So the two kinds of killing, in fact, continued side by side. And as I say, the separation between the two was much more geographical than one of a sequential time difference. Now, if 1941 then was the crucial what I call fateful months for the decisions that led to the final solution, 1942 would be the year of the most intensive killing, the most lethal year of the Holocaust. And I, at the beginning of my book, Ordinary Men, I had noted that in mid-March of 1942, some 75 to 80% of all victims of the Holocaust were still alive. But some 11 months later, by late February, those percentages were exactly the reverse. Some 75 to 80% of all victims of the Holocaust were already dead, and only some 20 to 25% remained to be killed. That the last 2 years of the war were in effect for the Nazis a mopping up operation. 43, 44, you had, of course, the great deportations from Greece, the liquidation of the Thessaloniki Greek community, and above all, the great deportations from Hungary in May, June of 1944. But in the rest of Europe, the Holocaust was mostly accomplished already. And what the Nazis were doing was finishing off the remnants of communities that they had already deeply wounded and were, in effect, finishing off a job that had already been substantially accomplished. So 1942 is the most lethal year. Over half the victims of the Holocaust die in 1942. This certainly distinguishes it from 1941, the year of decisions. Nonetheless, that pace of killing, in a sense, could not have been achieved, I would argue, except for the fact, of course, by late 1941, the Germans already knew what they were doing and where they were going. The consensus and understanding of the emerging final solution had already been achieved by late October 1941, and that's why the regime was able to move as quickly as it could in 1942, why the killing rate was so very high. Nonetheless, I do think it's important to underline that just because the final solution had been decided upon and the killing was now being carried out at a very intensified rate, does not mean that other decisions still had to be made. And that in 1942, in fact, the Germans would wrestle with a number of issues that still required decisions. Even as the final solution is already, in a sense, the policy, the goal, nonetheless, there are a number of things that still have to be decided. The decision-making does not end. And that there are a number of areas that I wanted to talk about now, where in fact debates continue among the Germans, where issues still have to be clarified for the final solution to move forward. The first of these was an issue of timetable or dates. If by late 1941, the Germans knew what the ultimate goal was, the final solution being the systematic extermination of all Jews within the German grasp, exactly when that would take place was still needed to be resolved. In the fall of 1941, the Germans used two different expressions about when the massive killing would begin. It would either begin, quote, next spring, or the other expression was after the war. Now, of course, in the fall of 1941, next spring, the spring of 1942, and after the war also meant the spring of 1942, because they expected to win the fall campaign and end the war in the fall of 1941. So they had two different ways of expressing the same timetable, the final solution, when the death camps were actually constructed, that the final solution could get underway, and that this was to take place both next spring and after the war, which meant one and the same thing. Now, in early December, of course, you had the Soviet Red Army counterattack around Moscow. Moscow did not fall. The Russians were not defeated. And then 2 days later, December 7th, under German urging, the Japanese attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. And one of the few times that Hitler actually kept a promise, he declared war on the United States, as he promised the Japanese he would do if they attacked the US and brought the US into the war. So now, clearly, the war is not going to end quickly. And so now, next spring and after the war do not mean the same thing any longer. And the Germans now have to decide between these two. Will they commence the final solution in the spring of 1942, even though a long war stretches out before them? Or will they postpone it until after the war, win the military campaign first, and then win their war against the Jews later? And so this is the first key decision that has to be made basically after the decisions of 1941. And then, in fact, it's still made in 41. It's made in December of 1941. The Wannsee Conference was scheduled for December 9, 1941. It is postponed after the Soviet counteroffensive around Moscow and Pearl Harbor and the German declaration of war on the United States. But a second meeting is not postponed. It is held December 12th, in which Hitler meets with the top Nazi party leadership. The Wannsee Conference would be a meeting with the heads of the ministerial bureaucracy. That gets postponed. The meeting of Hitler and the party leadership is not postponed and is held on December 12th. And that is where we know from an entry in Goebbels' diary that Hitler announces, quote, "The world war is here. The destruction of the Jews must be a necessary consequence." Now, my colleague Christian Gerlach has argued this was the fundamental decision for the final solution. That is, only when the United States comes into the war does Hitler invoke his January 1939 prophecy to the Reichstag that if the Jews start another world war, it will end not in the destruction of Germany, but the destruction of the Jewish race in Europe. And for Gerlach, the entry of the US into the war is what turns the war into a world war and thus triggers Hitler's prophecy and thus triggers the final solution. I think that is an incorrect interpretation for a number of reasons. First, even before the American entry into the war, Hitler had already invoked his prophecy. It doesn't require an American participation for Hitler to conceive of what he is doing as a world war that the Jews have allegedly started, and therefore triggers his prophecy. We know, for instance, in August of 1941, this is 4 months before Pearl Harbor, Hitler meets with Goebbels, and Goebbels records there, quote, "The Fuhrer is convinced that his Reichstag prophecy is coming true. It is coming true in these weeks and months with a certainty that appears almost sinister. In the East, the Jews are paying the price. In Germany, they have already paid in part, and they will have to pay still more in the future." In short, Hitler is confirming the two-decision process. By August, the fate of Soviet Jewry has already been settled, and the fate of German and European Jewry still awaits, but he knows more or less where he wants that to go. So the Reichstag prophecy has, in a sense, already been invoked, does not require American entry into the war. Second, we know that even in November of 1941, Himmler is already initiating other people. So is Heydrich. In November 41, Heydrich is sending copies of the monthly summaries of the Einsatzgruppen reports all over Berlin. 100 copies of each of these monthly reports is being disseminated. In the Foreign Office, for instance, one single report is circulated to 17 different desks where they are initialed. And who knows how many people at each of those desks actually read them. But thousands of people in Berlin are reading the Einsatzgruppen reports in November of 41. Clearly, the regime wants people to know that this is the new policy that they now have to get in line with. We know that Himmler, talking to Rosenberg in mid-November, resulted in Rosenberg then leaving the meeting and stating, quote, "The Jewish question can only be solved in a biological eradication of the entire Jewry of Europe. The Jewish question is only solved for Europe when not a single Jew lives on the European continent up to the Urals." It did not take an American entry into the war for the Nazis to invoke the prophecy and to understand that they were undertaking the final solution as an attempt to kill all the Jews of Europe. So I think in those regards that Gerlach's argument is wrong. The importance of the December meeting is not the fundamental decision for the final solution, but a key decision nonetheless as to timing. Will they commence the final solution even though the war is now going to be a long one, rather than wait until after the war? And the answer is yes, they will move straight ahead and fight both their war against the Jews and the military war at one and the same time. Now, of course, the Wannsee Conference is then held more than a month later, not until January 20th. And it had basically two key purposes. One for Heydrich, who summons the meeting and invites the heads of the state secretaries of the various ministerial bureaucracies in Berlin. First of all, was to disseminate the new policy and to enlist their participation, in which he's successful, but also to make clear that they understand Himmler and Heydrich and the SS are running the show, they are in charge, and that the other participants will be subordinate to the SS, and it is to establish Himmler's and Heydrich's unchallenged authority. And in that regard, both of these goals are achieved, and the Wannsee Conference, in my opinion, accomplishes exactly what Heydrich intended. It was not a decision-making conference. The decisions were made in the fall of 41. It is a enlistment recruitment conference and a dissemination conference, and a conference to establish basically the unchallenged authority of the SS as the agency in charge, and in that the SS is quite successful. Now, my colleague Peter Longerich has argued that the final solution was not yet fixed policy, that contrary to my argument that this happened in October, or Christian Gerlach's that it happened in December, Longerich still thinks at the Wannsee Conference that there is uncertainty. And he argues that on the basis that Heydrich, in talking about the, quote, impending final solution, talks about sending Jews to large work camps for road construction, and those who do not succumb to the physical duress of work will then eventually have to be treated accordingly. And therefore, he still sees the issue of Jews being sent to work and work camps as the current vision, and eventually they won't survive, but that there isn't an immediate plan for immediate extermination. The problem with that, of course, is the text really reads that, quote, Jews fit for work will be sent to the work camps, and then nothing else follows about what will happen to the Jews not fit for work. We know Eichmann said that Heydrich basically edited the notes that he gave him and removed certain parts. And I think this is one where, because it wasn't a matter of dispute, that in fact, Heydrich simply took out any reference to the immediate fate of the Jews who couldn't be sent to work, because then they could be sent to various recipients without necessarily revealing all that had taken place. But the cat, as said, it was basically let out of the bag, I would argue, if you look at the very last paragraphs of the protocol for the Wannsee Conference. At the very end, Josef Bühler, the state secretary for the general government under Hans Frank, basically asks, and says his only real request is the final solution begin in the general government. Now, why, he says? Because the transportation problem was no overriding factor there, and the course of the action would not be hindered by considerations of work utilization, because the vast majority of the Jews, quote, were not capable of work. Now, Bühler could say that because it was obvious to the participants of the conference that, in fact, the non-working Polish Jews were going to be killed very quickly. They were going to be killed close to the ghettos. That is, they're not going to be sent to work camps in the distant east. That the death camps in Poland were going to be set up close to the ghettos. They were not going to be killed through destruction through labor, but they were going to be killed immediately by other means because they were already deemed incapable of labor. So I think, contrary to my colleague Peter Longerich, if one parses the Wannsee Conference protocol carefully, his argument that clarity had not yet been attained, that the Germans were still, in a sense, uncertain about where they were going, is not confirmed by a careful reading of the Wannsee Conference protocol. Another issue that still had to be settled in 1942 was an issue of whether German Jews and German Mischlinge, German half-Jews, and German Jews in mixed marriage with non-Jews would have to be treated in a different way. Do these categories of Jews, German Jews as opposed to non-German Jews, half-Jews, and Jews in mixed marriage in Germany, require some kind of special consideration as a matter of being a more delicate situation for the domestic political repercussions. Now, we do know that in the fall of 1941, when deportations from Germany began, the first 20 transports went to the ghetto in Łódź, and the Jews arrived there. They were not killed immediately. The next 7 transports went to Minsk. We know the local Jews in the Minsk ghetto were killed to make space for them, but the German Jews were not killed. Then in late November, the next 5 transports were sent to Kovno, and they were killed immediately upon arrival. The first systematic massacres of German Jews deported to the east occurred in Kovno in late November, 5 transports, 5,000 people. Word of this spread immediately to Germany. This did not remain secret. And we know that there were domestic repercussions and shock, and that Himmler then belatedly ordered that the next transport leaving Germany, the first transport to Riga, he said, Jewish transport from Berlin to Riga, not to be killed. That order arrived too late. The first transport to Riga was massacred upon its arrival. But thereafter, the remaining 20-some transports that went to Riga, as earlier, were moved into the Riga ghetto, where space was made by shooting local Jews, but sparing German Jews. So clearly, Himmler had decided that the immediate killing of German Jews was still too sensitive a topic. Word of it spread too quickly, and that in Germany, this was still too hot a topic. So in fact, even though German Jews are being deported as of mid-October 1941, the systematic killing of those deported Jews is not going to begin until later. They are going to be basically put into transit ghettos and sort of kept in new ghettos in the east until the Germans figure out whether whether they can, in a sense, get away with doing that without repercussions. It is still too sensitive an issue as of December in 1941, January of 1942. At the Wannsee Conference, the bulk of the protocol is devoted to a discussion over the fate of Mischlinge I, that is Jews or people with 2 Jewish grandparents and 2 non-Jewish grandparents. Usually that means 1 Jewish father or 1 Jewish mother and 1 non-Jewish father or mother, and mixed marriage. And that Heydrich is very anxious that the Mischlinge I, that is half Jews, be included in the deportations, where they will share the fate, of course, of full German Jews at some point in the future. And he is opposed by the Minister of the Interior, State Secretary Stuckart, who says, no, rather than deporting the first-degree Mischlinge, they should be sterilized instead. They should be allowed to remain in Germany, even though they are half Jewish blood, but that can be neutralized by sterilizing them so that their Jewish blood does not get spread into the rest of the German population. And he proposes, so there are no more new Mischlinge, that all existing German Jewish mixed marriages be compulsorily divorced. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws, of course, had forbid any further new German Jewish marriages, but the ones already existing were preserved. What Stuckart is now proposing is all existing German Jewish marriages from before 35 are now nullified and are subjected to compulsory divorce. Now that issue, those 2 issues, the fate of Jews in mixed marriage and the fate of half-Jews in Germany, is not settled at Wannsee. And 2 further conferences are held in the spring and fall of 42, March and October of 42. And finally, it is Hitler who decides and is the most modest or most restrained of all. He says neither equating Mischlinge with full Jews, as Heydrich had wanted, nor sterilization, as Stuttgart had advocated, nor compulsory divorce. We will stick with the status quo. That in the end, Hitler was most concerned about the domestic repercussions. In the case of Jews in mixed marriage and half-Jews, they are too embedded in German society. They have too many German relations and friends to disappear in the way that full German Jews were. And Hitler certainly had learned the lesson from the euthanasia program. Germans had not raised any ruckus about deporting Jews. They had, of course, been highly disturbed by the killing of German mentally and physically handicapped. Why? Because they were family. They were people that had friends and family that were embedded into German society. Killing them meant no one was safe. And so for Hitler, his ultimate decision was, we will leave the issue of Mischlinge of first degree. We will leave the issue of Jews and mixed marriage alone. We will do nothing more about that. The status quo will continue, so that most Jews in Germany in mixed marriage and most half-Jews in Germany will survive the war. Third key issue that is still to be decided is the use of Jewish labor. Now, for the Nazis, they faced here a dilemma. On the one hand, they are waging a war, an essential war for Lebensraum in Hitler's views. That is, you don't conquer new territory, your country will go down. You either grow or die. So winning wars of territorial expansion are absolutely essential. To win wars of territorial expansion, you need a powerful war economy that is producing the tanks and guns and airplanes to win that war. To have a successful war economy that's producing all that equipment, you need workers, you need labor. And of course, the first thing that happens in war is that people are called up for military service and leave some of their jobs, that people are killed, and that labor shortages begin to emerge the longer the war lasts. So that the Nazis were facing increasingly over the war a labor shortage, not crucial in the first years of easy victories. That is, with blitzkrieg victories over Poland, Norway, France, Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Yugoslavia. But certainly once they're into the war against the Soviet Union, the issue of labor shortages will become ever more important. And certainly in 42, when they know they're in for a long war of attrition, then labor shortage becomes absolutely crucial. Two decisions they make in late 41 and early 1942 to try to solve this. In late 41, they decide they will stop allowing Soviet prisoners of war to die in mass, as they had been up to that time, that they will try to use them for labor instead. This decision comes too late. That of the 2.5 million Soviet prisoners of war captured in 41, 2 million of them are dead by the spring of 1942. The Germans had simply so mistreated them, deliberately not fed them, killed and shot many of them, that they destroyed a whole 2.5 million manpower pool that when they decided they wanted to use it, they had already lost it. So the turn to using Soviet POWs as a labor source was too little too late. And that they had squandered that potential labor source through their merciless treatment of Soviet prisoners of war that ensured the vast majority were dead by the spring of 1942. The second solution then is to engage in draconic roundups throughout Europe to bring forced laborers to Germany to work in German factories. And of course, what this does is to really spark resistance. In most occupied countries, in Nazi-occupied countries in Europe, there wasn't a lot of resistance until 42. But once the Germans start carrying out these mass roundups and young men are going to be seized off the streets and sent to Germany for forced labor, many of them, of course, go underground or they flee to the forests or the hills, they join the resistance. And what the Germans have done in trying to solve their economic problem is to increase their military problem. Now you have active resistance in many countries in Europe, and you need even more military to deal with the resistance you provoked. And of course, for that, then you need more workers to support them. And they've just driven most of these workers into hiding and joining the resistance. So the Nazis, in fact, are shooting themselves in the foot. They're engaged in a vicious cycle of self-inflicted wounds. And they're solving neither their labor problem at the same time as they're intensifying their difficulty, the military challenges they face. It is under those circumstances that they finally have to now face the possibility that Jewish labor might be indispensable at the very point they've decided all the Jews must be killed. So this will be a second ideological dilemma that they inflict upon themselves, that they are committed to the final solution, but they have painted themselves into a corner of desperate labor shortage, and thus, for at least some Nazis, not all, the priority for preserving Jewish labor becomes ever more important. And the result of this is basically that the Nazis have no consistent or uniform policy about using Jewish labor. It's contested in different areas by different people, so that different policies are pursued in different places at different times. There is not a single Nazi policy about Jewish labor. It is a fluid situation, constantly in motion, and one that is a result of the fact that the Nazis cannot resolve their double dilemma of both wanting to kill all the Jews, but needing Jewish labor to win the war that they're also engaged in, and that they have basically conflicting priorities that cannot be easily solved. Now we know even in 1939-41, before the labor shortage was acute, in Poland, Nazi authorities did already differ with one another over whether to mobilize Jewish labor or not. When the Nazis decided on ghettoization, and again, that was a local decision, and so that took place at different times in different cities in Poland. But once ghettoization became general and Jews were moved into ghettos, usually sealed, they were cut off from their old jobs, cut off from their old businesses. They had no way of making a living. And the Jews in the ghettos began to starve. And of course, crowded together, epidemics began to basically intensify, especially typhus. And that many local Nazis realized that if you triggered vast epidemics and mass starvation, this would have repercussions far beyond the ghetto walls, and that they would have a huge public health mess and economic disruption on their hands. And so a quarrel emerged really between local Nazis, those that I had called the attritionists, those that wanted to let the Jews simply starve to death and die of disease, and the productionists, those that wanted to put the Jews to work in order to feed themselves and to avoid the most dire consequences of epidemic and mass starvation that would jump the ghetto walls and could not be self-contained in the ghettos. And thus, in most places, ghetto economies emerged. Lodz was certainly the most systematic of these, but Warsaw eventually, Białystok, and a series of work camps in Silesia, run by so-called organization Schmelt, an industrial buddy of Himmler's that basically set the model that would be followed later by people like Schindler. That is, you would organize a factory, you would bring in Jewish workers, set up a camp right on the factory grounds, and you would produce military goods with Jewish labor in your private camp. These would be private factory camps. In the fall of 1941, with the onset of the war, of course, as I said, the Germans first tried to use POW labor and found that they had squandered that opportunity. And so in 1942, Himmler, at least briefly, has to entertain the idea of a mass use of Jewish labor instead. And that is, I think, the background for Heydrich's remark at the Wannsee conference that those Jews capable of work would be sent to work camps in the East. And a week later, Himmler talks about sending 150,000 Jews to Auschwitz for labor as well. And we know in Goebbels' diary in March of 42, when the liquidation of Polish ghettos begins, and German Jews are being sent to, in a sense, fill the empty spaces in some of those ghettos that are being liquidated, talks about a 60-40 split, that 60% of the Polish Jews will be murdered and about 40% will be left for labor. And we know from conferences held in June of 42 that even that late, the SS is assuring the civil administration in Poland, who is organizing basically this employment of Jewish labor, that Jewish workers and their families will be spared deportation. That is, the notion is non-Jewish workers and their families would be sent away as a undesirable burden, but that Jewish workers and their families would be spared, that workers would not be very productive if their families had been murdered, so that families would be left intact. So the spring of 42, the notion is that Jewish labor will be used fairly extensively. That changes in June, July of 1942, above all in decisions driven by Heinrich Himmler. And we don't know really why, but there's a number of possible reasons, probably that converged together for his change of heart. One was the assassination of Heydrich in late, wounded in late May in Prague and dies in early June, which certainly hardens Himmler. Second was the expectation of a new offensive on the Eastern Front, that Germany could still end the war in 1942, that victory was once again thought to be in sight. And the third was the looming food shortage. That is, not only is Europe short of labor, but as the war goes on, food supplies drop drastically. Obviously, all the kind of chemicals that are normally used for fertilizer are going into other stuff, particularly the production of explosives, and that farmers who normally work the land are being sent off to the army, so that both in terms of fertilizer and agricultural labor, these are both drastically reduced, and that food supplies in Europe are plummeting, and that in order to, of course, avoid the worst consequences of food shortages, and Germans here think back to the dire year of 1917 in World War I, when the British blockade finally reached that critical point. The Germans on the home front began to suffer drastically from food shortages, and what this did to German morale, preparing the way for the unrest behind the lines in Germany that many Germans attributed the defeat to. That for Himmler, it was very important that Germans never suffer food shortages again. And so one way, of course, to reduce the mouths to be fed would be to intensify the liquidation of the Jews as quickly as possible. I think probably all of those contributed, but in any case, what we do know, we don't know the reasons for sure, but we do know that in July of 1942, Himmler orders that all the existing arrangements for the use of Jewish labor in Poland be canceled. All of those agreements and promises are ended. That he sets a date of December 42 for the entire liquidation of Polish Jewry, which of course is by far the largest mass of Jews within Nazi control. And that the only exemptions will be a very small group of Jewish workers that he calls, quote, the real armaments workers. Anybody working on anything other than actually making guns and ammunition is considered, in a sense, a fake armaments worker. Only those really involved in the absolute undisputable military necessity of producing weapons would be allowed to continue. And they will be put into special camps. They will not be allowed to remain in ghettos. And they will be kept as property of the SS, as slaves of the SS, to be rented on a contractual basis per fee per day from the SS to German industrialists. So that while some Jewish workers will still be allowed, this is nothing like 40%, which had been envisaged earlier. This is going to be much more like about 10%, and that the vast bulk of potential Jewish workers are going to be killed. This is not going to be destruction through labor, working Jews to death. This is going to be destruction of potential labor, killing people who could have been put to work if the Germans had given priority to the use of mobilizing Jewish labor, but are going to be killed instead because they're going to prioritize the final solution. And that's the key intervention and the key decision that Himmler makes with Hitler's backing in July of 1942. So by 1943, there are some Jews still working in labor camps under these conditions. But even that, Himmler is very dissatisfied with. In 1942, he argues anyone who is arguing for the necessity of Jewish labor has been basically infected by the Jewish spirit. That is, citing economic reasons for keeping Jews alive is materialistic. It is not ideologically pure. It means you become infected by the Jews and their mammonistic, materialistic ideology, and you are suspect. In 1943, a second reason is added for the destruction of Jewish labor, despite the severe labor shortages. And that is, of course, increasing Jewish resistance. That by end of 42, early 43, when Jews are alive in Poland and in Soviet territories, only in labor camps or in so-called remnant ghettos, the small groups that are left behind in the ghettos, or of course in the forests or among partisans or in hiding, the ability of the Germans to play the game of divide and conquer, to go to the ghettos of the camps and say, we're going to take, half of you, but if the rest of you are continue work and are good, we'll let you live. The illusion that there can still be a saving remnant through labor, that if people only are passive and cooperate and allow incrementally for the Jewish population to be murdered, there is some hope that still be a surviving remnant. By 43, that is gone. And that Jews are aware that ultimately they're all to be killed. So that in most camps and ghettos, the resolution is, if the next time the Germans come, we will resist. We were not going to allow some people to be taken away under the promise that others will be spared. And this, of course, is seen in January of 43, when the Germans come back to the Warsaw Ghetto and try to take out 10,000 Jews, where they're met resistance in the first time. And then subsequently through 43, Himmler then realizes that the game of divide and conquer, of incrementally reducing labor camps and remnant ghettos does not work anymore. That basically 43, he's going to devote to a systematic elimination of these camps and remnant ghettos in what amount to quasi-military operations. That is, different camps will be targeted. Troops will be brought in from the outside. He doesn't trust the people that run these camps and ghettos any longer. He thinks they have learned to profit from it, that they have been contaminated too, that they have been, in a sense, become captured by their captives. They're tools of the Jews who are trying to persuade them of their Jewish, indispensability of Jewish labor. And so these operations generally are run, as they say, kind of quasi-military operations in which surprise attacks on these ghettos and camps are made by troops brought in from outside to liquidate the ghetto or the camp in its entirety in a very sudden operation. Warsaw, of course, is the most famous. Where the German offensive begins in April of 41 and drags on into May. In June, the camps of East Galicia, the D4 camps, are all liquidated in this kind of operation. In August, Bialystok is liquidated in this kind of operation. In early September, the camps of the Eastern Krakow district are liquidated. And then finally, in early November, the horrific Erntefest operation. Over 40,000 Jews in work camps in the Lublin district are killed in 2 days, November 3, November 4, by mass troops that are brought in from the outside to carry out this systematic extermination of Jewish labor. At that point, Himmler, however, reaches his limit. That at that point, Jewish labor is still key, but in only certain areas does it survive. In the satellite camps and the main camps of Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Gross-Rosen, in Płaszów, Alan Gert's camp, and the satellite camps like Schindler's camp in Krakow, the munitions camps of the Radom district, and the Łódź ghetto. And those 4 pockets of Jewish labor survive. By now, even Himmler can't have those liquidated. The military situation, labor shortage, have become so dire that Himmler's campaign to systematically liquidate all Jewish labor comes to an end, and that Jewish labor, in fact, is being brought into Germany during the Hungarian deportations and remains basically as indispensable to the German war effort until the end. Well, let me summarize very briefly, in a sense, what I've tried to argue. That 1942, in contrast to 1941, is the great killing year of the Holocaust, the year of most intense lethality, in which over half the victims of the Holocaust are killed in a single calendar year. And secondly, despite the fact the Germans obviously know what they're doing overall, there are still a number of areas in which decisions have to be made. The timetable of the final solution in relationship to the war, the fate of German Jews, Mischlinge, and Jews in mixed marriage in Germany still had to be settled. And above all, the fate of Jewish labor continues to be contested, continues to be a very fluid situation through 42 and onward. And that after 42, as I've argued, other than Hungary and Greece, the final solution for the most part is a mopping up operation in areas where the bulk of the Jews have already been murdered.